مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. ماذا تفعل الدول عندما تنوي مؤاكبة بلد آخر ولا تريد أن تخوض هروبا معه؟ في أوروبا في الماضي كان الملك يطلب من البابا حرمان ملك آخر كنسيا بسبب خطاياه، وبالتالي طرده من المجتمع الديني. كان ذلك عقابا قويا، لكن البابا اليوم لا يتمتع بالقوة نفسها كما كان في الماضي، وهذه هي الطريقة ليست فعالة كما كانت في السابق. لكن الفكرة الأساسية لا تزال مستمرة: العقاب من دون عنف أو حرب. والشكل الأكثر اعتدادية هو العقوبات الاقتصادية. العقوبات موجودة في كل مكان، إنها الأداة المفضلة لدى الحكومات التي لا ترغب في القتال. عقوبات على روسيا لاجتياحها أوكرانيا، عقوبات على إيران بسبب برنامجها النووي ودعمها للإرهاب وسجلها الفظيع في حقوق الإنسان، عقوبات على سوريا لقتلها شعبها، عقوبات على السياسيين اللبنانيين بسبب الفساد، ولها تطول عقوبات عملية مؤكدة لفردها ومؤكدة لإنهائها. هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن سنلقي عن كثب نظرة على العقوبات مع اثنين من أكثر خبراء واشنطن إطلاعاً، المسؤولان السابقان في وزارة الخزانة كاثرين باور وداني غليزر. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Sanctions are everywhere. They are the tool that we are using to punish Russia for invading Ukraine. They are the substance of negotiations with Iran over the Iran nuclear deal. We use them all over the world. What are they? Are they effective? Who orders them? How do you end them? All these questions about American sanctions policy, and I'm delighted to welcome Danny Glazer and Kate Bauer to help explain it. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me here, Rob.
So it may sound simplistic, but why does the United States government, why have we gotten so used to employing sanctions as a tool of foreign policy? Danny, let's begin with you.
Sure. And again, thanks for having me here, Rob. I think it's a really interesting subject, and it's quite timely. Countries have been using sanctions for thousands and thousands of years. Thucydides himself talks about using sanctions and economic power in his book about the Peloponnesian War. So this is not a new concept. What's new is the position that the United States finds itself in within the global economy and within the international financial system, and that is one of a superpower. As much as the United States is a military superpower, it is equally a superpower with respect to the global financial system and the global economy. And when you combine that might with its closest partners in the UK, in the EU, in the G7, it becomes an ability. They have together the ability to project financial and economic power to an enormous extent. Again, then you combine that with the hesitancy for a variety of reasons to intervene militarily, and all of a sudden you find yourself with sanctions and other financial tools as one of the key, if not the key, foreign policy, national security tool that the United States and its allies like to deploy. We saw this emerge about 20 years ago in the wake of the of the 9/11 attacks, when the U.S. and the Europeans and the whole world, for that matter, started to deploy financial sanctions in the war on terror. The United States reorganized its Treasury Department in 2003 and 2004 to allow itself to start thinking strategically about it, about its role as the custodian of the dollar, the world's reserve currency, and to then integrate these strategies into its broader national security framework. And that's when you start seeing the use of sanctions against North Korea, the use of sanctions against Iran in a strategic context. Ultimately, the use of sanctions against Russia in 2014 in the wake of Crimea. And then you get to today, where it's really been put on steroids in a very short period of time.
And Kate, you've been in this world throughout the period when Danny just said sanctions have exploded. How have you seen the change just since you started dealing with sanctions as a tool?
Yes. Thank you, Rob, for including me in this discussion today. It is a very timely conversation to be having. And it seems like it always is a timely time to talk about sanctions these days. I think Danny is absolutely right. Over the last 20 years, we really have seen a huge expansion of the use of tools of economic power for coercive ends and to counter various national security threats. And I think the big evolution has been this recognition that we can use the position as the world's global reserve currency because of the role of the dollar, because of the way the international financial system is structured, to be able to kind of set the rules of global finance in a way to say who gets to be involved and who we're going to keep out of this, and use that as a coercive tool, oftentimes, to try to change the behavior of our adversaries, or to protect the U.S., our national security, our partners' national security, and to protect the financial system in particular from abuse by bad actors. And I think there has been a real recognition within the U.S. government and other governments and international organizations of this role, and a real concerted effort to put the tools in place globally, not just in the U.S., but so governments have the ability to adopt and implement multilateral sanctions, international sanctions, domestic level sanctions, so that they can protect the financial system from being exploited, and so that they can use sanctions to generate leverage, or try to generate pressure against adversaries.
When one reads news stories and you see that we've imposed thousands of sanctions, 3,000, 5,000 sanctions against governments, individuals, corporations, institutions, this is a huge undertaking. So let's peel this back a little bit to help explain what some of this means for our viewers. So Kate, who makes these decisions in the U.S. government to begin with? Who's responsible for this sanctions process?
So there's a lot of different places where decisions about sanctions are made. And, as they're integrated as a tool of national power, they're part of the decision-making process, at the highest levels of the National Security Council and at the White House. But when they're integrated into a strategy and then implemented, it normally falls to the Treasury Department for financial sanctions. The State Department and Commerce also have other authorities that they can use. Within the Treasury Department, there's the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is the implementer of U.S. sanctions.
All right, when we come back after the break, I'm going to ask you both specifically about Russia, how we got to this massive sanctions program, and whether it's going to be effective in compelling change in Russian behavior. In just a moment. Again, my guests today include Danny Glazer. Danny spent 13 years at the Treasury Department fighting terrorist financing and illicit criminal money flows. He rose to the rank of Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes before moving into the private sector. Also joining him is Catherine Bauer. Kate Bauer is my colleague at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Previously, she served at the Treasury Department, including as financial attaché in Abu Dhabi and Jerusalem. An expert on sanctions and illicit financial flows, her portfolio over the years has stretched from Iran to the Gulf to the Palestinian areas. All right, let's talk about Russia for a moment. Press reports describe the imposition of Russian sanctions in just the last couple of weeks as remarkable. How are we able to gather the information to effectively cut the Russians out of the global economy in the virtual blink of an eye? And do you expect these sanctions to have a political effect on decision-making in Moscow? Kate, let's start with you.
So it's a great question. And I think it's important to kind of draw a distinction between two broad types of sanctions. And one would be those that are based on specific types of behavior, and the other one would be those based on a status. And so I think one of the things that has made it possible for the government and actually the international community to move so quickly, in this case with Russia, and as well as in other country sanctions programs, is a lot of the sanctions are based on the status, just saying this is part of the Russian government. This is part of, and the Russian government is engaged in these behaviors. But putting together the evidence to sanction a specific element of the Russian government or a bank tied to them or oligarchs tied to them is more just based on their status and not necessarily the individual behaviors of those entities. So they're just not as sometimes don't require as much intensive research as doing terrorist-related designations, for example. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is that there was quite a buildup to the conflict, to the war we're seeing in Ukraine today. And the U.S. government did start, several months ago, but also going back several years had been targeting sanctions on Russia. So although this conflict moved very quickly and the sanctions were put out with incredible speed, I would say, I think that the pace was surprising to me, knowing how much work it takes to do all of the things that were involved. I think it is quite remarkable. But this isn't the effort to target, to understand the vulnerabilities of Russia's economy, to understand where these sanctions would be most effective, to understand how to minimize some of the externalities, to try to protect energy flows, for example, and try to keep those working. Those are efforts that have been ongoing, I think, for years within the U.S. government and elsewhere.
Danny, have you ever seen an effort to isolate a country as large as Russia from the global economy? Do you expect this to be, how do you measure success in such an effort?
Yeah, Rob, this is, as you said, you used the term remarkable. I'm not even sure that's a strong enough term. This is absolutely unprecedented what's happening right now with respect to Russia. We started our financial pressure campaign against Iran in the summer of 2006. Now, of course, there had been sanctions on Iran long before that. I would describe those as passive sanctions, if you will, and they certainly weren't universally adopted. But the U.S. government and the U.S. Treasury Department in particular began its attempt in a strategic way to financially pressure Iran summer of 2006. We got up to full-scale pressure 2011, 2012, so 5 or 6 years it took us to ramp up. We went almost that far over the course of a weekend with respect to Russia. When the Russian tanks first started rolling, the U.S. and the Europeans announced a sanctions package that was very similar to what was announced, what was implemented for Crimea in 2014. It was relatively light. It was well within what I think the Russian leadership was expecting and well within what they were prepared to accept. That was on a Thursday. By the end of the weekend, SWIFT 7 banks were being removed from SWIFT. When a week earlier, it was specifically stated that SWIFT was off the table. Nord Stream 2 was canceled when it had been specifically said that energy was off the table. Germany and Italy were openly talking about ending their reliance on Russian energy. And a week later, you're seeing the beginnings of energy boycotts of Russia. That was all that quick, and I think it's going to be catastrophic for Russia. I think it's going to be absolutely catastrophic. The U.S. and the EU aren't even hiding what they're trying to do, which is one of the things that's even more remarkable to me. Normally, sanctions will be talked about by government officials with a series of euphemisms. The U.S. and the European Union is openly stating that they're trying to crash the Russian ruble. They're openly stating it. They're openly stating that they're trying to prevent Russia from gaining access to its reserves, so that it can't prop up the ruble. I think this has to go far beyond what the Russians had expected, and far beyond, frankly, what I thought the Western alliance was capable of in such a short period of time. Now, will it be effective? I think it's important to remember sanctions don't turn back tanks. When the U.S. and the Europeans and NATO in general said that it was not going to intervene militarily, that set a certain limit as to what the West is going to be able to accomplish with respect to turning the Russians back. These sanctions are not going to stop tanks in their tracks. That said, these sanctions are going to create an enormous amount of leverage for the West, especially over time, especially as they bite more and more, and especially as I think the West continues to ramp them up. Ultimately, these sanctions are going to be a tool, as all sanctions are, a tool of a broader policy of containing and ultimately rolling back Russia from Ukraine.
And in the process of doing this, Kate, how does our government limit the damage to ourselves? A big economy like Russia, cutting them out of the global economy is going to have victims even on our side. How do we limit that?
Well, I think that there's going to be an impact on, our economy. There's going to be an impact on the global economy, regardless, considering, Iran or Russia's position as a major oil exporter, more major exporter of commodities, wheat and other grains, and just the size of its economy and the impact that's going to have on Europe, on Eurasian countries, those that are most immediately on the borders, and on the Middle East, of course, as well, in terms of commodity prices. The things that the U.S. government can do to try to moderate some of those externalities are things like licenses and carving out certain parts of the sanctions. For example, the sanctions on the Russian financial sector carve out transactions for energy. But I think what we're seeing is that because of the incredible pace and scope of the sanctions that have been put in place already, that it's a lot of leveraging market forces, and that the private sector is saying this can move very quickly and it can broaden quite considerably. And so we're going to pull back and be very conservative about how we position ourselves vis-a-vis the Russian economy right now. And that means that it multiplies the impact, and it makes it carving out certain elements to try to mitigate the impact on the U.S. economy and the global economy that much more difficult. And I would say also, kind of adding to what Danny said, that I was also very surprised by how quickly these moved in one weekend. And I would say, one of my kind of first takeaways and responses, having worked on a lot of the sanctions that were rolled out during the Arab Spring against, countries in the Middle East, whether it was Gaddafi in Libya or Assad in Syria, was that in that first weekend, we did things that were where we got to in the end on those programs. So things like sanctioning Putin. When we moved to sanction Gaddafi or Assad, this was kind of saying, this is it. I would say it's very hard to rehabilitate a leader, after you've sanctioned them.
I think it's important to underscore confronting Russia in Ukraine is not going to be cost-free. International leadership is not cost-free.
All right, we're going to have to hold it there. This is a fascinating discussion. I didn't even get a chance to go into Iran or the other examples. So perhaps we'll have a chance to pick this up another day. I want to thank you both, Kate Bauer, Danny Glazer, for joining me on Dakhel, Washington. We are now about 3 weeks into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So far, the Ukrainians have stunned the world with their tenacity, determination, resilience, and bravery. Everyone expected Russia to act as a superpower, swiftly taking their smaller, weaker neighbor with stunning speed, the way American forces took Iraq nearly 20 years ago. But the Russian onslaught has stalled in its tracks, with Russia suffering, by some estimates, as many casualties in 2 weeks as it did throughout the entire Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Why? Because Ukrainians had so much more to fight for than Iraqis, and a leader who inspired with grit and courage, not one who overpowered with fear and cruelty. In this post-nationalist age of Facebook, Google, and Amazon, when whether or not to like a post is considered heroic, ordinary Ukrainians have reminded us what real heroism is all about, and what it means to live and die for a freedom many of us too easily take for granted. I don't know where this ends, even if it's correct to use the term end. That's because I believe we have entered a new era, as consequential as the era that began in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the one that began in 2001 with the attack on the World Trade Centers. This is the ultimate return of history, a return to a war of empire in the heart of Europe, a return of total war, a return to an era when a power sought to destroy the rules of the international order, not just bend them to his whims and preferences. Once these genies have been unleashed, it is difficult to see how they get put back into their bottle. When we look at past episodes, we see uncertainty and surprise. When the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, starting World War II, the dominant global reality was German-Soviet partnership. But that didn't last, and the two became enemies just 2 years later. Is today's China yesterday's Soviet Union? Could we see the possibility of China distancing itself from Russia, perhaps just to save its own imperial designs? Or then there's the post-9/11 unforeseen consequences. Who imagined on September 12th that America would soon begin the longest war in its history, a 20-year conflict in Afghanistan? Who envisioned we would send tens of thousands of troops and spend $1 trillion in Iraq? Neither were self-evident that bright Tuesday morning in September. What will be the unforeseen consequences of Ukraine? I don't know. The options are many, and they aren't reassuring. How this ends for Ukrainians is difficult enough to contemplate. How this ends for the world is a whole new level of uncertainty. All I can say is that, like the childhood rhyme suggests, I doubt we will be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. The world will be a very different place. Nasalu il-Hatam هذه الحلقة من داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أي أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذا البرنامج وبالأخص بالشأن السياسة الأمريكية هي للاجتياح الروسي لأوكرانيا، الرجاء التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سوف أراكم في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك الحين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.